Welcome to My Best Save, the podcast where the world's top surgeons reveal their most extraordinary moment in the operating room. Get ready for gripping stories of life-saving maneuvers that defy the odds. I'm your host, Dr. Jeremy Nikfarjam, a board-certified plastic surgeon in New York City. Discover the secret to surgical heroics that become legendary educational cases. See you in a stitch. Hello, my people. I'm Dr. Jeremy Nikfarjam, Dr. Nick, board-certified plastic surgeon right here in New York, coming to you live from the OR. Welcome to My Best Save, the podcast that highlights the healthcare heroes and their amazing stories of life-saving measures. I am your host. I'm new to this game, but I have to tell you, it sort of comes natural because as you'll hear in my previous episodes, I love what I do. This is a passion. I wake up in the morning and I'm like, I gotta be at work. And when I'm at work, I feel at home. I don't even wanna go home. So this is the life that I've always wanted. The ability to be able to save people's lives. And this podcast is all about that. To find similar healthcare heroes who are just like me with the same mindset of wanting to save the world. So tune into our previous episodes. We had amazing stories to share, kind of the upbringing and training of a surgeon, the scenarios that we encounter, and how we have this rare opportunity to make a difference and save people's lives. This episode will be amazing. We're going to talk to you about a unique encounter I had on a flight. I had to land a plane. No joke. So many moons ago, we're talking almost about, let's say, almost a decade ago, I was a young, vibrant plastic surgeon, the youngest plastic surgeon grad in the country, which I was very proud of. I can't say that anymore, right? So I was preparing for my board exams. Now, board exams are not the typical exams that we're all used to. For people in healthcare who eventually pursue a specialty of any kind, whether they are a doctor, a PA, nurse practitioner, or nurse, they all have to take a board exam. And the plastic surgery board exam is extremely rigorous with a very high failure rate. Don't think of these exams as just being a simple pass measure. They actually are a challenge appropriately to really weed out those providers who are just not safe. And we really focus on safety and expertise and being trusted experts. So we plastic surgeons, when we graduate residency, after all those years I described in episodes 1 and 2 and 3, after those years, we now have a 1-year period where we have to be, quote, collecting cases to be board certified. And during that board eligibility process, we are very careful clinicians, as we always are. We follow our patients, take photos, document, and we really are meticulous about our care. It's a great habit to build when you're a young surgeon to figure out, for the next 40 years of my life, what are the important habits of today? And I think it's a beautiful process. So I'm collecting for my board exams. You know, many doctors take classes and courses and they actually fly out for days to prepare for these rigorous tests. Well, yours truly here didn't do that because I felt, you know what? I can wing it. I'm a winger. I don't know if that's a word, but I'm a winger. So I decide to get on my flight to Phoenix in preparation to the boards. And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to study on the flight. I'm one of those guys. I'm like, I'll do it last minute. Imagine preparing for a book of an exam that's this thick, multi-volumes, and you have to know everything in the body. Plastic surgeons have to know head to toe. There is no anatomical confinement. We have to know the anatomy of everything, which is, you know, a small, daunting task. So I get on this flight, and like many flyers, as you notice, I'm one of those guys that I wear a hoodie, I have headphones in, and I have my laptop or book open, which is the universal flying sign of do not disturb, right? Like, just let me be. So I'm on this flight, and it's a very packed flight going to Phoenix from New York. probably, I think it was at 4.5 hours, 5 hours, somewhere there. We board this flight, no problems. I'm sitting next to a bigger guy on my right and someone I can't remember on my left. And the second I sit and we're situated, I whip out my laptop, have all my data in front of me prepared, and I start going through information, right? Clinical scenarios, the documentation, the anatomy, everything's in front of me. I'm like, this is my time. Uninterrupted study time, which I haven't had ever since I started practice. I was so busy operating, I didn't have time. And now I do. So as this flight takes off, I'm minding my own business, and we're in air maybe for about 45 minutes, maybe to about an hour. And my headphones are in, and I feel a nudge, like a little, one of those little elbows from the guy next to me. How fun could that be on a flight? Kind of going like this, and I look at him, and I'm like, what does this guy want, right? Weird. I take my hood down, I take my headphones off, and I turn to him like, sir, can I help you? He's like, they're asking for a doctor. And, I do one of those looking around. I'm like, do you mean me? And they're like, yeah, they're asking for a doctor on the flight. So I put my cape on. I spring into action. I'm like, part the seas, out of my way. I get into the aisle. I walk to the back. I meet a flight attendant. He's like, are you a doctor, sir? Are you a healthcare professional? I say, yes, I'm a surgeon. And they come with me. And I get escorted to the back last row of this flight, right before the bathrooms, that last final row. And it's just me. It's me looking down, and I see an older lady sitting on a chair who looks a little uncomfortable, a little sweaty, a little huffed and puffed, kind of taking deeper, longer breaths. And something tells me that she can't breathe the way she wants to. So I sit down, and what does every good physician do? They take a history. They don't start with something procedural. We start with gathering information. So I ask her what her name is. Where is she coming from? And I say, ma'am, what are you feeling? Doctor, I can't breathe. And I'm like, well, why can't you breathe? What do you feel? She goes, I'm having a tough time taking a real full deep breath in. And I'm like, well, tell me what you feel. When I take a deep breath in, it just doesn't ventilate, it doesn't fill my lungs up all the way. I feel short of breath. So I ask her, are you normally short of breath? She goes, well, no, I'm normally fine. And I said, you're a little elderly. Are you traveling alone, or are you with family or friends? She goes, well, my daughters had to leave me during the connection. I connected from Europe to New York, now heading back to Phoenix. So they separated from me, and I'm now flying alone. Well, that right there is a red flag, right? Elderly person traveling with their family, now alone, is not so important for physiology, for the function of the patient, but it's important because they often have supportive measures that their family helps them with, making decisions, moving and mobility, gathering medications. A lot of things are needed for elderly people sometimes. So I said, that's okay. I'm going to be with you, but tell me what you feel. She goes, well, when I walk, I'm a little short of breath, but usually when I sit down, I gather myself and it gets better, but now I'm not feeling it's getting better. And I'm like, well, when you flew from Europe to New York, were you feeling the same kind of feeling? She goes, no. And I said, well, what's the difference? Did something change in your connection? She goes, no. I'm like, does it happen to you before? She goes, no. I'm like, well, why do you think that is? And she says to me, because I usually have oxygen. And I'm like, well, lo and behold, that's the problem. She's not flying with any oxygen. So right there, red flag went off my mind. Is an oxygen-dependent person who's flying without oxygen. Well, then I kind of gathered, are you experiencing any chest pain, any lightheadedness, any arm tingling, arm swelling, arm pain, one-sided, etc.? The goal is to gather now more information to rule out other problems. Could it be a heart problem? Could it be a body problem? Could it be the way her musculoskeletal system is able to take in a breath? Is she just fatigued, right? We want to make sure it's not just the lungs, it's something else. Could this be a blood clot? Are her legs swollen? Is she having one-sided pain versus another? Physicians, we go through a differential diagnosis. Now, I can't tell you as a surgeon that I'm the best at a differential diagnosis here, but we can do something, right? We're in a kind of an attenuated sort of situation here on a flight. So I go through the motions and I figure out that she is an elderly former smoker, has some form of what she thinks is emphysema, and is an oxygen-dependent person, flying on a flight without oxygen. So after I kind of go through the motions, I do my best to do a physical exam. Examine her head and neck. Does she have any distension of veins? Does she look blue? Is she a general pale person? Is she dehydrated from all these breaths she's taking? You look at her mucosal membranes in the mouth and in the nose. Is this someone who's not hydrated properly? The hardest thing to do on a flight is to listen to their lungs because we don't have a stethoscope. I actually asked the team to pull something and they couldn't. They had no equipment available. So I did an old school thing. I put these big ears on the back of her chest and listened the old auscultatory way to her chest. Deep breath in, deep breath out. Deep breath in the back on her back. I actually tried to even use a cup to help me do this too. I got to the abdominal exam of the extremities, and the conclusion I came to is she is probably someone with emphysema who's oxygen dependent, not experiencing a cardiovascular event like a heart attack or stroke, but she needs oxygen. So I'm thinking, this is simple, right? I have my answer. I'm on a flight, and lo and behold, there is oxygen everywhere. We'll just drop that oxygen from the overhead, like we all seen those introductory videos on a flight, and problem solved. Well, I was, interestingly surprised. So I told the flight attendant, can we ask whoever's needed, maybe it's the captain, I don't really know, I never did this before, can we just drop some oxygen so she can get a little oxygen and feel better? 2 minutes go by, and I then noticed that the flight attendant brings me tanks of oxygen. And I'm like, great, we have oxygen on this flight. It should be easy. So she brings me and she goes, is a tank okay, doctor? I'm like, a tank is perfect. We had a nasal cannula. We had the tubing. Then she brings me a tank that looks almost like what you have at a birthday party. A little tank like this used to almost inflate balloons. And I'm looking at this thing and I'm like, this is not a medical grade tank, right? This is not legit. So I said, I'm like, ma'am, how many of these do we have? She goes, well, we have 4. I'm like, bring me all 4, please. And I look at the tanks. I'm like, that's okay. We can start with this. So I turned the tank on to 1 liter, put the cannula on the patient, and she just becomes so much more pleasant, so much more comfortable. Heart rate comes down. Her oxygen levels get better. They're about in the high 80s to low 90s, which is a little uncomfortable. Now go to mid 90s. She can take a more comfortable breath. And I'm saying, she's better, I'm better. Doctors, we feed on our patients. If they are better, we're better. So I'm breathing a sigh of relief. I'm like, listen, my friend, I saved this lady's life. She's doing great. Well, we're in a 4-hour flight and about 20 minutes go by and tank 1 starts going south. It's empty. And I started thinking to myself, well, these tanks may not be full. I look at tank number 2, half, tank number 3, tank number 4. These are not full tanks. Someone's been tampering with these tanks. What do we do? So I put the second tank on her. I try to ration the oxygen, titrate it down to what a real bare necessity was. I was lucky to have a pulse oximeter. It's a device that measures your oxygen levels live, to understand how low could this oxygen be to minimize the usage of the oxygen in the tanks. This is not a fun task. We don't want to ration oxygen. You can ration food, water. You can't ration oxygen. We need it. So I start playing this game of Dr. Chemist, of playing with oxygen to the patient's titration. And, as the patient feels more comfortable, I start feeling more uncomfortable. And I'm looking at these tanks and I'm realizing we don't have more than maybe an hour and a half's worth of oxygen for this lady. And this lady will not be able to tolerate not being on oxygen for a while. So I tell the flight attendant, call the captain. And interesting kind of events fold out here. I'm there with our patient. Flight attendant comes in and goes, the captain wants to speak to you. And I'm like, me? She goes, yes, you, doc. I'm like, okay. So I stand up, I go to the back of the plane. They give me one of those old school phones that has a cord that's wide. I'm like, I haven't seen since the 80s, right? And I get on the phone, and all I hear on the phone is, it goes, doctor? And I say, captain? Almost like out of the movies. And it goes, hi, doctor. I am Captain so-and-so. I'm like, hi, I'm Dr. Nikfarjam, plastic surgeon. And he goes, well, doctor, what is your assessment? I said, well, there's an elderly lady with emphysema, oxygen dependent, flying without oxygen. We need oxygen. There doesn't seem to be too many tank, time available here. He goes, well, doctor, how much tank time do you think we have? And I didn't even know tank time was even a phrase. Never dealt with this before, right? And my calculation is like, well, I believe we have about 45 minutes, maybe an hour and 15 minutes of this time available in the tanks. And the captain said, well, thank you, doctor. We have about 2.5 to 3 hours of flight time. Well, obviously we have an issue here. So I say, me, doctor, tells the captain, no need to worry, captain. Why don't we just release oxygen from those overheads? And the next line the captain tells me just terrifies me. And he says to me, well, doc, those oxygen delivery systems are only for an emergency when the airplane's below the deck, as they call it. And I said, well, no problem. Well, why can't we have the plane go below the deck? It says that's below 10,000 feet, and that's only for an emergency landing. And I'm like, well, then that's not an option. So he goes, doctor, be in touch. Click. So I'm in a predicament now. We have limited time. This rare commodity that we need called oxygen is diminishing. And the whole thing is, can I maintain this patient not being on continuous oxygen? So I do what I think I know how to do, and I turn the oxygen off and watch her. Then I turn the oxygen on and watch her again. I create intermittent doses of oxygen to see if the patient can last for whatever time. And I tried this for about 20, 30 minutes, which seems to be successful. But as the time goes along, she can't handle it. And I make the determination that we have about 45 minutes left now of oxygen time, and we have about an hour and a half left of a flight. That gap, do you think we can do it? Now, this comes down to a principle of how are we trained as physicians? Are we trained to take risks? No. Are we trained to test the limits of what we can handle? Not unless we're forced to. The best care you can imagine is our backup plans. And backup plans involve layers of planning and having things ready in case there is escalation of an emergency. So, and the second part that is to maintain your head. Knowledge is power, and the preparation that comes with that knowledge is how you mitigate anxiety, right? We know we have plans. We know we have knowledge of the patient. We have data we can look at. We know how to make this better. And if it's not better, how can we implement an emergency response? So I've determined that there's not enough oxygen for this flight. So I tell the flight attendant, get the captain on the phone. See, now I'm like an expert. I know exactly how to talk to this captain. Do one, the next one is expertise, right? So I get on the phone and I say, captain? And he goes, doctor? I'm like, captain, we're not going to make it. We need to plan an emergency landing. Now I'm telling the captain this, and it's just pretty gutsy, right? And the captain says, I agree. I'm like, oh, thank God, someone agrees. I asked the flight attendant to call for any healthcare professionals on the flight, which I did many times. I asked them to bring any medications they have, including oxygen, if someone had on the flight many times, and no one responded. At this point, I tell the captain this exact thing. There's no other responders. There's no medication. There's no oxygen. We don't have access to the plane's oxygen. We got to land. The captain says, hold on. I hang up the phone. He calls back and he says, how is New Mexico or somewhere along the lines in 30 minutes? I say, we're cutting it very close. Then he calls me and says, Little Rock, Arkansas, 20 minutes. I'm like, you got it. So we've determined that that's the best time course for us. I have never been on a commercial flight that has made such an abrupt change in their scheduling. We all sit down, the captain announces, ladies and gentlemen of the crew, we're about to make an urgent landing. I think he said emergent landing, which sounded kind of scary, but for a sick patient on the flight. At this point, I think the passengers got wind that such a thing was actually happening. And it wasn't for the purpose of the plane malfunction, it was for the patient. So they kind of were not so out of stir crazy, anxious. So at this point, we sit down, we buckle up, I'm next to the patient. I haven't studied for a minute. I have got zero, right? I am on a nerve-wrecked flight dealing with this patient. And the oxygen is dwindling. This plane is, you're on a commercial flight, it's a gradual descent. This is a real jet descent. I'm talking about 45 degrees. Hold on to your hand, to your handles here. I'm holding the patient, literally, this elderly female. And I am literally, we're going down this long circular descent. And the most ridiculous thing happens on this time. As we begin to see land and we see this plane coming down really fast, we're all terrified. And this patient, as we get lower and lower, and now the oxygen is almost basically done, I look over and I'm sweating bullets. I'm oxygen deficient at this point. I look over and say, she looks so much better. She's breathing. She takes the nasal cannula off. She goes, I don't like the way it feels. She looks amazing. And this plane makes a landing, boom, lands, almost like out of a movie, like the movie Fugitive, right? The plane lands, I see ambulances and police line up, and I look at her, and she looks incredible, like absolutely incredible. I look disheveled. The plane just hits the tarmac. There is no actual landing, that gate. The door opens, paramedics storm the back of the plane. I get up to give a sign out, and she looks incredible. She sits up at the stretcher, it's getting stretchered out, and starts waving to the passengers. And, I'm thinking, this lady was on the brink of death. This lady was not going to make it. I get up and I start walking back to my seat, and all the passengers are looking at me saying, this is the doctor that made us land this plane. Some people clapped. Some people were appreciative. But people looked generally really upset because I ruined the itinerary. And I ruined my itinerary too. I sat down. I sit next to the gentleman who now is looking at me. And I'm looking at him like, you're the one who alerted me to this. I said, thank you for alerting me to this medical emergency. And he said to me, well, was she okay, doc? I'm like, yeah, she's okay. He goes, she looked a little cyanotic, a little bit in respiratory distress. I'm like, wait, dude, these are two medical terms. I looked at him like, sir, are you a healthcare professional? He goes, yes, my name is such and such, retired OBGYN. Shakes my hand. I look at him, I'm like, buddy, we had an emergency. Where were you? How come you didn't help me? He goes, I didn't want to intervene. I have no malpractice. Well, that blew my mind. We all unboarded this plane, had a 3-hour delay. I had some passengers say, thank you, doctor, for helping that woman. I called the woman's daughter and gave them the sort of story. They were very appreciative. And I learned how to manage a patient on a flight in an emergency situation. I landed a plane, and I think I saved a life. And I learned that from now on, when I fly, I'm not taking off that headphone. Thank you for listening to my story, guys. My best save. The flight with a life saved. Thank you.